Good evening. For those of you who may not know me, I'm Mary Holt, the current president of the Historical Society. Welcome and thank you for joining us in person or on Zoom for the Historical Society's Ellsworth Miller's Memorial Lecture Series. And that's established by Cap Leonard. The Board of Trustees offers sincere thanks to Cap for his continued generous support of the lecture series. Sincere thanks also to the Chebeague Community Church for making it their lovely space available to our organization. Also worthy of great appreciation are our technology crew members, Richard Hackle, our current technology guy, and John Holt, ever present for everything assisting. Before commencing with the lecture, I wish to acknowledge and honor the Indigenous people who were first to inhabit Chebeague, forage its fields and forests, and fish its waters. You will find in the back of the church a donation jar if you wish to support the efforts of the Historical Society. Please save your questions relative to the lecture. They will be addressed following the lecture. Those zooming in are asked to type their lecture questions in the chat box and select "to everyone," so that you all can see your questions. You won't be repeating questions. Also, those of you on Zoom, under View in the top right corner, consider selecting Side-by-Side Speaker to avoid covering the slides included in the presentation. Tonight's lecture, Chebeague and the Battle of the Atlantic, 1939 to 1945, will be delivered by former Historical Society President Toby Webb. At this time, it is my pleasure to introduce Toby. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary, and thank you all for coming. As the tech crew adjusts something. Okay. Tonight's topic is Chebeague and the Battle of the Atlantic during World War II. I don't consider myself a naval historian, but in the 1970s, when I was serving in the Navy, I was in one tour, the gunnery officer on a destroyer. And one of the weapons that I was responsible for was a strange thing called the hedgehog. And I learned that the hedgehog was a weapon that had been invented during the Battle of the Atlantic to meet a very specific purpose and overcome a particular problem. And so I've always been interested in what was going on in the Battle of the Atlantic and how did the hedgehog fit into that. What I'd like to do with us tonight is talk a little bit about the Battle of the Atlantic generally, the context for it, what were the strategies and the participants involved in it, what were the major weapons that were used in it, what were some of the effects of the Battle of the Atlantic on Chebeague itself, since we're right here nestled into the North Atlantic, and then talk about some specific Chebeaguers who took part in the battle itself. I'll spend quite a bit of time talking about one particular convoy that a Chebeaguer was deeply involved in. And finally, I'll just wrap up with a little bit about how history has treated the mariners, the merchant mariners who participated in the Battle of the Atlantic. This battle was the longest continuous military campaign in World War II. It started on September 3rd, 1939, which was the day that Germany declared war on Britain, and they attacked what turned out to be a passenger liner, not a military ship, that first day. And it ended on the day that Germany surrendered. 2 freighters were shot by U-boats on that day, and 1 U-boat was sunk. It involved more than 100 convoy battles between large forces from both sides, and more than 1,000 single ship encounters during the war. The Allies in that period lost 3,500 merchant ships, 14 million tons worth of shipping, and 175 warships, 36,000 sailors, 36,000 merchant seamen were lost in this particular fight. And the Germans lost 783 out of just over 1,000 U-boats that they had built, and 47 surface warships. About 30,000 German sailors were lost, which was 75% of their entire U-boat force. So major losses on both sides in the battle. What were the Allies' goals during the war and this particular aspect of it? Trying to set up an economic blockade of Germany, and later after Italy became part of the Axis of Italy. Most important from the outset, delivering domestic and war materials from North America to the United Kingdom and later to Russia starting in 1941. At the outset, it was estimated that Britain needed more than 1 million tons of imports per week to be able to survive and fight the World War II. And then from 1942 on, the Battle of the Atlantic involved supporting military operations in North Africa and the Mediterranean, and staging Allied supplies in Great Britain for the eventual invasion of Europe. But all of that material had to come across the Atlantic from North America to be prepositioned for the battles to come. The German goals in reverse were to stop those merchant ships from carrying the supplies. They thought at the beginning of the war that they'd be able to starve the British people and the British military into submission. They also obviously wanted to stop the Allied offensives into Europe and to lift the blockade that was being formed against Germany itself. The German assets, principal assets, were U-boats like the one shown here, aircraft, fleets and convoys are particularly susceptible to attack from the air, and the German Luftwaffe was particularly strong. And they had a strong surface navy, particularly led by 2 battleships were among the largest that had ever been seen. the Bismarck and her sister ship, the Tirpitz. The Bismarck was sunk by the British in 1941, but the Tirpitz remained a major threat to any surface operation that the Allies might undertake. Just for a sense of how powerful the guns are that are shown here, those are 15-inch guns which could shoot an 1,800-pound projectile over 20 miles to ships that were still over the horizon. Another asset that the Germans had in planning this was the difficulty of providing air cover to any convoys that were heading across the Atlantic. This chart shows the principal route to England, and solid lines show how far land-based aircraft could fly to protect those convoys. And you'll see that right south of Greenland, there's a big section that was called the Mid-Atlantic Gap, or just the pit, where the convoys could no longer be protected by aircraft. And so that made them very attractive targets for U-boats. The Allied weapons at the outset of the war, for carrying all that freight, just the merchant ships, which were usually unarmed, Liberty ships, which were starting to be built at an accelerating rate here in the States, land-based air cover for as long as the aircraft could get out to protect the merchant ships, and then smaller armed surface warships. In Britain's case, mostly these were refurbished civilian ships, fishing trawlers and the like, which had been armed with anti-aircraft guns, sonar, and depth charges. Sonar, or ASIC as it was known in Britain, was a technology that the British had developed after World War I. It involved sending a sound wave from a surface ship out underwater, listening for an echo, and from that echo being able to estimate the range to and direction of an underwater target. Sonar had important limitations, however, though. It required the surface ship that was sending out the signal to be traveling at very low speeds, so that its own noise didn't overpower the listening device that was involved. It only sent signals outwards, not down, so that if a submarine was below you, particularly if you were doing a depth charge run, you lost track with where it was, giving the submarine an opportunity to maneuver. It didn't give you a constant contact with the target. It was only an occasional ping off of the submarine. And once you dropped depth charges, because depth charges were preset to explode at various levels, depths as they went down, the explosion was going to go off whether you hit the submarine or not. But it disrupted the ability to use sonar any further because of the turbulence it created in the water. This is an example of a depth charge explosion astern of a British sloop, and you can see what an explosion it creates, whether the submarine is there or not. And so that was one of the drawbacks of the early weapons that the British had. Impacts on Chebeague. Clearly, there were a number of wartime restrictions here in the bay, because the inner bay was a principal staging area, not for the convoys themselves, but for the the American escort ships that would travel out to accompany them across the Atlantic. So you can see from this chart that there was a very narrow lane along the shores for civilian boats. There is a barrier from Deer Point across to Long Island beyond which civilians could not travel. And there is what was known as the gate between Bar Point and Little John's, which could be raised or lowered to let either military or civilian traffic through but would hopefully keep submarines out the rest of the time because this was considered a prime target for submarine warfare. This is a photo from the time of the Nellie G at the Little John dock, and you can see the submarine net suspended behind it in the picture. Another impact on Chebeague was that Portland was a location for building the Liberty ships, fast-produced freighters that could carry all of these supplies across the Atlantic. And Chebeaguers were involved taking jobs in construction in South Portland and the shipping yards to do that work. This photograph is from an exhibit that was held a few years ago at the Historical Society on World War II, and is a tribute to Staticia Hamilton Osgood, who was given the honor of christening one of the Liberty ships because her husband, Charles Osgood from Chebeague, had a perfect attendance record at the boatyard. And so she got the opportunity to smash the champagne bottle across the bow of the SS Sandbury as she was launched in South Portland. But what was needed for all of these Liberty ships as they were being mass produced to carry all of this material across the Atlantic was people to sail them. And perhaps the greatest asset that Chebeague had was experienced mariners. And after seeing posters like this one, they all started to step forward. Ellsworth Miller was one of those. He and Sanford Doughty enlisted on the same day together. And you can read that he said that he was going to join the Coast Guard once the lobster season was over. But they started turning out the Liberty ships so fast that they needed the men to man them. And that's why he and Sanford went into the Merchant Marine. Others who joined from Chebeague, Rory Campbell, who towards the end of the war was in a ship that was torpedoed off of Long Island. Ashley Johnson, Louis Moynihan, who we also know was on a ship that was torpedoed. Bud Robinson clearly served in the Army from this picture, but before that, he had served in the Merchant Marine as well. And then father and son, Clyde Colbeth Jr. and Sr. I'll be talking more about Clyde Colbeth Sr. in a moment, but Clyde Colbeth Jr. Was on a ship that was torpedoed. And this was the certificate he got to identify him as an experienced torpedoed seaman. But these are also the ribbons he was awarded by the Warshipping Administration, which oversaw the building of the Liberty ships and then the assignment of them to the various trips across the Atlantic. And if you look across these cards, you'll see that he was confirmed for having active service in the Pacific War Zone, in the Atlantic War Zone, in the Mediterranean Middle East War Zone, and then that he was also awarded the Merchant Marine Combat Bar. If you look at the ribbon, there's a small word star beside it, which that means is that's not his first combat bar. He was being awarded it again because he'd gone through yet another battle. Now, early in the war, the Germans were quite successful with their U-boat techniques, attacking merchant ships that were leaving the States. Within the German Navy referred to June 1940 to February 1941 as the happy time. In just June to October in 1940, over 270 Allied ships were sunk with no major losses by the naval forces of Germany. The U-boat captains and crews became pop stars back in Germany during this period, heralded and sort of legendary. One became very famous for when he encountered a convoy, not shooting at it from the outside, but sailing right up into the middle of it, and then shooting his torpedoes in both directions to totally confuse the convoy. The challenge for the U-boats was just locating the convoys. it was a very big ocean. And usually that was done visually by the U-boats themselves. Sometimes they had reconnaissance aircraft that could help them locate a convoy. But a lot of the time it was done by themselves, particularly in the early days when U-boats were stationed off of the coast of the United States. We weren't technically at war yet. We were just sending merchant ships over. And so there were no blackout requirements for the ports along the East Coast. And merchant ships would sail out, and at night they'd be silhouetted against the lights of the city, and the U-boats had an easy shot. They also in this period had deciphered one of the British naval codes, and that helped them understand where the British forces were likely to be. The British had developed through what we would now in business call operational research, I think. The understanding that the most efficient and safest way to send materials across the ocean was not by independent merchant ships that made their way as best they could, but in convoys protected by a small number of destroyers or other anti-submarine ships. But the convoys would be clustered to cover the smallest area of the ocean as possible. And that would make detection of them much more difficult. That new technique on the Allies' part was met by a new strategy from the U-boats, where instead of going one by one after individual merchant ships, they would create wolf packs that would go after convoys as well. The way the wolf packs worked is they would take a number of U-boats, sometimes as few as 4, in one attack as many as 30, and create a line across the course that they thought the convoy was likely to be followed. They'd watch through periscopes or while surfaced for signs of the convoy coming over the horizon, and then by radio alert all the other U-boats so that they could assemble, and at night, in the dark, to maximize confusion, attack the convoy. And it was a devastating technique once it was put into place. It was conceived by Admiral Dönitz, who was the commander of the U-boat force. And early in the war, he found that the most effective way to use his U-boats. And so he abandoned most other tactics and relied on wolf packs through most of the rest of the war. But the British, as I'd said, had developed the convoy system, and this is what a convoy would look like from the air. They all had plans to line up in neat lines and columns, and everybody had an assigned station. But most of the merchant mariners were not used to sailing in formation. Some of them were slower than others, some of them were more adept than others, and so keeping them in position within the convoy often was quite difficult. So this one you can see up front, there are a couple of things that look like lines, but then it gets a little more scattered as the convoy works back. The role of the convoys changed in the spring of 1941. We still were not in the war yet, but it was clear that it was coming. Stalin, before the war, had signed a treaty of alliance with Hitler. And historians have learned since that Stalin's plan was to let Hitler fight all the way across Europe, battle the British, battle the French, get them all out, and then to betray him and pick up the pieces in Eastern Europe himself for the Soviet Union. But there's no trickster like a trickster, I guess. Hitler betrayed him first. And on June 21st in 1941, Hitler invaded Russia with 3 million soldiers and destroyed most of their air force in the very first day of his attack. Churchill, knowing that the enemy of my enemy is my friend, offered Stalin aid and started to try to woo him into an alliance with Great Britain and the United States. And he convinced Roosevelt, who was at that time still buying time because the nation had not decided to go to war, convinced Roosevelt that this was a good stalling technique as well, to get something going to keep Russia alive against Hitler until an invasion to protect the rest of Europe could take place. And so the merchant ship runs, which had been mostly up to that point from the East Coast to Great Britain, following the Gulf Stream and good warm weather up across the North Atlantic, at least in the summer, they got extended to go into Russia and deliver supplies for Stalin to Murmansk and Archangel, the first ports that were reachable from the Atlantic and beyond what the Nazis controlled at that point. This required two new routes for the convoys to take. One of the major issues they had to deal with was the Arctic ice, which in the winters descended well south of Bear Island, which you'll see in the center of this, this map. And the summers would retreat back a bit so that the convoys could go north of Bear Island. And that was important because they were trying to stay as far away from German controlled territory and German bomber bases as they possibly could. So these were the two routes that got laid out for the travels to Murmansk, which is just north of the Kola Peninsula log there, and then Archangel, which is down in the White Sea and a little harder to reach, but a little further away from Germany. The Murmansk run, as it came to be called, had new perils that the convoys had not experienced in the North Atlantic before. These were new routes. They were north of the Arctic Circle. It was about 0 degrees Fahrenheit in July, dropping to -40. Because of the summer daylight, it meant you had daylight almost all day long for German bombers who were looking for you to be able to find you. The polar ice, as it expanded, as the weather got colder, would push the convoys further and further south towards Norway, and very close to the German warships and U-boats and bombers, which by that time were based in Norway and in Finland. That's what the ocean would look like on a normal day on the run, not the Gulf Stream. And the red areas here are the areas that had been occupied by Germany at that point, so that they had assembled all of their Atlantic bases really along the outer western edge of Norway. Hitler remained convinced that England was going to try to invade Norway to take that back. And so he built up a lot of forces along that side and had bomber bases and submarine bases there as well. So as the routes for the convoys got pushed south, they were being pushed further and further into the range of the bombers. Just a normal day at work on the Murmansk run. Sanford Doughty and Ellsworth Miller had enlisted together on separate ships. They both made this run to Murmansk. And this is Sanford on the left and Ellsworth on the right. They never actually served on the same ship, but one day in Murmansk, Ellsworth Miller was on the signal light and decided to take a break and was relieved by somebody else who took over for a moment, who immediately got a flashed message saying, is Ellsworth Miller on your ship? And the signaler said, well, yes, he is. And he said, well, tell him Sanford will see him when we get back into port. One of the most famous convoys to go to Murmansk and eventually Archangel is where they ended up. It was only one of 149 convoys that made that run during the war. But it included a freighter that was skippered by Clyde Colbeth of Chebeague. Most of my understanding of the chronology that I'm going to share with you comes from this particular book that came out about 5 years ago, The Ghost Ships of Archangel. But there have been a number of documentaries that you can find on YouTube or PBS streaming services about this particular convoy, because it, as you'll see, was a very important one in the whole development of the war. This was Clyde Colbeth's ship, the Silver Sword. It was a commercial freighter, which had been fixed out for this particular kind of military transport. Those things that look like flying saucers on the far right, if you look at them closely, are actually assembled aircraft that were being taken to Russia. So the convoy formed off of Iceland to make this run to Russia in June of 1942. The convoys had a numbering system at this point. PQ were actually the initials of somebody in the British Admiralty who just decided to add this for the fun of it. And if it was going from the States to Europe, it was PQ. If it was coming back in the other direction, it was QP. So you know which way the convoy was headed. And this is what the assemblage of a convoy would look like as they set out to make their voyage. It had been assembled, this particular convoy, assembled by the British Admiralty and the US War Shipping Administration, which I had mentioned before. It had 35 merchant ships carrying what would now amount to over $11 billion worth of war materials to get them into Russia, because Stalin was making such a stink with Churchill and Roosevelt that you say you're supporting me, but you're not doing anything for me. Get me the materials. Its defense was assembled by the British Admiralty. They were responsible for protecting the convoy. It had 6 destroyers close in and 5 smaller armed vessels. For those of you who have not been in the service, the size of Navy vessels, the biggest ones are the battleships, and then slightly below those are the cruisers, and then below those are the destroyers, or known affectionately by those who have bounced around on them as tin cans. And they are particularly adept at anti-submarine warfare because they're fast and maneuverable and can follow a submarine as it makes its escape maneuvers. So that was the force that the British Admiralty had put in close to the convoy. About 50 miles away, they assembled for hopefully a big sea battle, 4 heavy cruisers, destroyers, all under the Admiralty command, with orders to drop away before coming within German bomber range. The British didn't have that many vessels at this point, and they were very concerned about losing their surface fleet. So, but if German ships came out to where they were outside the bomber protection, the German bomber protection, then the British were prepared to go into a fight with them. And then hundreds of miles away, sort of disguised, and hopefully it wouldn't be discovered, there was a distant cover force of a British aircraft carrier, 2 battleships, 12 destroyers. And what they were hoping for is that the Tirpitz, which was the other monster battleship that the Germans had, that the Tirpitz would come out, stray beyond its air cover from the Luftwaffe, and be taken out in a major sea battle in the middle of the Atlantic. But the British Admiralty was very uneasy about this whole project. First, they were very afraid of the Tirpitz. In a 1-to-1 battle the year before, the Bismarck had sunk the Hood, which was one of the British leading ships. They had scarce naval resources, and here they were being put at risk for this very dangerous run to Russia. It didn't escape their notice that if they weren't delivering these supplies to Russia, they probably would have come to Great Britain instead. And the summer route that was envisioned still was going to send the convoys within 250 miles of Norway, well within the bomber range. So in particular, the British Admiralty sought regular intelligence on where was the Tirpitz and its battle group. The German battle plan was called Knight's Move. The Allies didn't know this, but because of political infighting between Admiral Raeder, who was the head of the German Navy, and Hermann Göring, who was the head of the Luftwaffe, and had better access, we believe, to Hitler's ear, the German Navy was actually very short of fuel. And so they had limited authority to actually put to sea. So the plan that was developed for convoy PQ-17, which the Germans knew was coming, was to attack it with bombers and U-boats first. Then when it was well within German air cover, to send out the Tirpitz and other surface ships to finish off the convoy. But there was one specific direct order from Hitler that was involved. The Tirpitz could only sail if any Allied aircraft carriers that were with the convoy were taken out first, because he didn't want to risk another battleship. The Bismarck the year before had ultimately been sunk by a raid of British aircraft. And so he didn't want to be within range of those. But if there were no aircraft around, then the Tirpitz could sail out to meet the convoy, but he had to personally approve the sailing. So the convoy sailed from Iceland on June 27th of 1942. A group called the Ice Devils, which were 10 or 11 U-boats, history is unsure, lined up across the likely convoy route. The German air bases in Norway canceled all leaves so that all the pilots would be there and available for the raid. And the Tirpitz itself, which was in an anchorage at Trondheim in Norway, prepared to set sail to go out for the attack. First couple of days out, the convoy, which was going north of Iceland, encountered very thick ice, so thick that 3 ships were damaged right then and had to return to Iceland, 2 freighters and 1 surface warfare ship. But by July 1st, German long-range reconnaissance planes and 2 of the U-boats had found the convoy. The next day, a British float plane, which they would launch off of a ship and then try to winch back on if they could recover it, or at least winch back on the pilot if they couldn't recover the plane. The float plane saw that the ice had retreated enough with the summer weather coming on that the convoy could sail the northern route, north of Bear Island, which they wanted to do because it would keep them further out of German bomber range. But late that day, 7 German planes attacked, but were chased away by the defensive forces around the convoy. 1 German plane sank 1 of the Liberty ships, the Christopher Newport, on that day. And the Tirpitz battle group left the Trondheim anchorage and headed up the Norwegian coast. There was fog, however, and the German pilots looking for aircraft carriers to meet Hitler's condition on the sailing of the Tirpitz couldn't look because there was fog cover on the sea. Finally, a British plane flew over Trondheim and saw that the Tirpitz had gone. They didn't know where it had gone, but they knew it was gone. And British code breakers, who already at this point in the war had broken some of the German codes, they knew that one of the cruisers that traveled with the Tirpitz had left Trondheim and had reached its station further north. So the British intelligence was clearly showing that German ships were on the move to intercept the PQ-17. The next day, Germans got confused intelligence that there might actually be 2 aircraft carriers with the convoy. And under Hitler's order, Tirpitz couldn't move. Admiral Raeder, seeing a great opportunity for the Navy to have a great success, sent a message to Hitler to try to get the order lifted, but he was told, I would guess by Hermann Goering and the Luftwaffe, that the Fuhrer was not available, because Goering immediately attacked with 23 bombers, attacked the convoy. Several freighters were sunk, a Liberty ship was sunk, a Russian tanker that was accompanying the convoy, and interestingly manned almost entirely by women, that was hit but survived and managed to stay underway. 4 German planes were downed in that strike. And so the sense on the convoy was, boy, we just beat off the Luftwaffe. That's, maybe we can make it all the way. This is going to be okay. But this is a photograph of the convoy taken from a German reconnaissance plane on July 4th. So clearly they were within the sights of the Germans. The Silver Sword, if in position, would have been back in about here in the formation. Sir Dudley Pound was the head of the British Admiralty, the first Sea Lord and the Admiral of the fleet, the senior most naval officer in the British Navy and responsible for this part of the war. He had a number of concerns weighing on him as this was all playing out. There was the risk to his dwindling supply of surface warships. He had no news on the Tirpitz's location. There was intelligence already received that U-boats were near the convoy, and the U-boats, of course, could torpedo a warship as well as a merchant ship. And he struggled with this belief on his part that this was a mission which was a political necessity, but not a military necessity. And he was risking a lot of assets for satisfying Stalin, but making no true strategic advantage. He also at the time was under great personal stress. He was the first Sea Lord because of all the experienced admirals from World War I who were still around and recruitable. He was one in better health than almost everybody else. But that didn't keep him from having a very painful arthritic hip, which kept him from sleeping. And so he was known to nod off in meetings sometimes. And he'd recently had a diagnosis of a brain tumor, which he in fact did die of the following year. So there was a lot on his mind while the convoy was cheering, we've just defeated or pushed off the Luftwaffe. And this is what the U-boats and the Luftwaffe had succeeded in doing. This was one of the freighters in PQ-17 going down on that first day. And so Admiral Pound reached a decision that only one of all of his assembled officers agreed with, that none of the officers on the ships agreed with, and that has been controversial ever since, but you can at least understand his reasoning. He said, we're dispersing the convoy. Most immediately, the cruiser force that was protecting would withdraw westward back towards Iceland and the States at high speed. And immediately, owing to the threat from surface ships, the convoy is to disperse and proceed to Russian ports. That just meant it's every man for himself, and you will have no protection from the British defensive force. The initial assumption in the convoy when they got these orders was obviously the Tirpitz must somehow have gotten in behind the force and was approaching from the west. And so all of these cruisers and things were being sent out to meet the Tirpitz. So they all headed west, leaving the smaller ships and the merchantmen on their own. Many even of the escort ships said, well, in the grand scheme of things, where will I be of greatest value? If there's a battle against the Tirpitz, that's where I ought to be. And so they went westward as well. But a number of them were furious about abandoning the ships they'd been instructed to protect. And the convoy scattered, and German planes watched all this as it was happening. They thought that the convoy was scattering because they had just gone through the air battle and were afraid of being a sitting target for another air battle. They didn't know about the order from the British Admiralty. So if you're a merchant captain on one of those ships, what are your options? Well, it would be logical to try to go east to the nearest Russian port. It would be, and just take your chances on racing there as fast as you could. It would be logical to try going west to return to Iceland where you'd started. I suppose there'd be some logic in saying, I'll head south towards the German forces, because there was the possibility, at least, that once your ship was sunk, somebody would rescue you. But the illogical choice of them all would be to head north into the ice pack. So Captain Kolbeth headed north. And he wasn't alone in reaching that conclusion. In all, there were 4 ships that said going north is the way we should go. Now, how that decision was reached depends on who's writing the history. And so if you read the British-based versions, it was the captain of the Ayrshire, a fishing trawler that had been fitted out as an anti-submarine warfare ship, who made that decision, brought in 3 ships he could protect, and headed north. But for reasons I'll explain in a minute, I think that Captain Kolbeth was the first person to head north. So the Ayrshire was a coal-burning ship, and so if he was going to go north and try to hide from the from the Germans up there, and then eventually make his way, he was going to need coal, and so he went alongside a freighter called the Troubadour, which was carrying a lot of coal, and said, will you make this voyage with me? So that became a mini convoy of 2. And then another freighter, the Ironclad, they encountered as they headed north, and brought that on board. And the 4th ship that they, the 3rd new ship that they connected with to create the 4-ship convoy was the Silver Sword, which says to me that the Silver Sword had been out front first because it was the furthest north by the time that the Ayrshire caught up with it. But whoever's idea it was, 4 ships ended up heading up into the ice pack as opposed to east, west, or south. This was the Ayrshire. This was a fishing trawler. It had anti-submarine warfare, it had sonar, and it had depth charges and some deck guns. It was commanded by a British lawyer who had been pulled into the service during the war. His greatest military credential was he had a certificate of competency as master of a pleasure yacht. But evidently he was quite a character and a good man to have around in a situation like this. And this was the Troubadour, the Panamanian freighter that was brought along because of its coal supply. And here's the Silver Sword again. I don't have a picture of the Ironclad, but the Silver Sword made up the next, the final ship in the four ship group. And I had wanted to point out at this point again, the aircraft that were there on its decks to be delivered to Russia. So the 4 ships headed north into dangerous ice. It's not easy to head north in that particular part of the world because the ships had magnetic compasses and you were so close to magnetic north that the compasses were just spinning around and spinning around. But the ice, if you got into it, would at least protect against torpedoes. Those are generally launched from near the surface, and the ice would either be in the way or shield you from being spotted. And the Ayrshire put its depth charges and its oil drums on its bow on the theory that if they met the Tirpitz, at least he'd try to ram it and do some damage that way. This is a map that is on the Russian embassy website in Washington because they still celebrate the heroism of this particular convoy. I couldn't get it in a form that I could enlarge enough for all the reading to be done, But what I wanted to share with you here are just the red arrows, because those are the German attacks on convoy PQ-17. And you can see that they went out in all directions. This is a photo taken by one of the German U-boats as it entered the debris field of one of the Liberty ships it had just sunk from PQ-17. The day after the dispersal order, they were heading north, and the Ayrshire sonar recorder operator heard large underwater explosions only 20 miles to the south of them, and suddenly lots and lots of radio SOS calls. The Germans, it turns out, had caught the merchant ships who had made the choice of heading east towards Russia. And so a number of them were being taken out in that battle. No carriers had been found so far, however, so Hitler agreed to let the Tirpitz group sail. The Ayrshire maneuvered deeper into the ice fields, but it was clear skies overhead. So if a bomber chanced their way, they were going to be there in the ice and very, very visible. So they made an unusual decision, which is they had a lot of white paint on board the 4 ships, and they just decided to paint everything they could white. So at least on the southern facing sides, so that they would be less visible against the ice floes. And when they didn't have enough paint to cover everything, they brought out the laundry and covered the decks with sheets. And their plan was just hide longer before running to the east and trying to get to Russia. Later that day, because the U-boats and the bombers had been so successful, the Tirpitz, without ever firing a shot, was told to return to port. Goering was convinced that he and the U-boats could take care of the rest of the convoy. So here's a photograph of the Troubadour in the process of painting itself white. So up north they went. And finally, after on the next day, the 6th, they were 25 miles into the ice field. And the ice was just too thick to break. They were using some of the ships as icebreakers to try to ride up on the ice and break it so that they could travel further north, but it was getting too thick. They were only 600 miles from the North Pole at this point. 800 miles still away from Archangel, their port, but 350 miles from this strange island group called Novaya Zemlya, way over here, which had been Russian territory before the war. They thought it was still Russian territory, but they couldn't be sure that the Germans hadn't taken over it. But it was the nearest land, and so they decided to head for that and see what they could do. Another reason for moving was that on that day, the winds shifted and was pushing from the south, so that all the ice they had worked their way through was now being pushed up against them, and they had the risk of being just frozen into the ice if they didn't get out quickly. And so they left hiding and sailed east along the ice edge they planned to go to the far side of Novaya Zemlya and then come down out this side and then down into Archangel. But that's the Kora Sea, I think it's called, and it's even colder than the Arctic. So they weren't sure they were going to be able to make that. This is a picture of the Ayrshire from the Troubadour. The Troubadour was carrying tanks to Russia, as well as all that coal. And they quickly activated the tanks and started moving the turrets around and getting ready for a possible anti-aircraft or surface battle using the tanks as their weapons. Next day, they got out of the ice. They heard another major explosion, so the Germans were still picking off stragglers. They entered a fog bank to hide and started hearing more SOS calls coming from the southern end of the archipelago that they were heading for. Radio Berlin at that point in a major propaganda move because the American forces and the British had not said anything about this catastrophe so far. Radio Berlin broadcast a list of the 22 ships they'd sunk, 23 ships, and then included by mistake the Silver Sword, so that if you were here in the States getting the report on Chebeague about what was going on, you would hear that Clyde Colbeth's ship had been sunk by the Germans. After a couple of days, they reached the northern tip of that archipelago and found, as they had feared, that the eastern side was totally choked with ice. So their only choice was to sail south along the western edge of that. They knew that there was a Russian weather station at a place called the Matukin Shar, which was a channel through the archipelago. And their plan was to go down, actually stage a raid on the weather station, and if it was under German control, fight it out. If it was under Russian control, use the weather, the radio that they assumed a weather station would have to work out some sort of rescue plan. When they got there, they found out that other remnants of the convoy had reached that Novaya Zemlya, mostly in their lifeboats, even though it was a 350-mile trip. They'd been at it while the 4 ships of this group were up in the ice. And so there were a number of people there, but unfortunately the tides also were bringing in the bodies of people who had not made it safely off their ships. The Germans, the U-boats, however, were happily going home to celebration in their port in Norway, where they received the Iron Cross for their victory over the convoy. Some of the U-boats, however, were still at sea. And so on the 10th of July, yet another freighter, as it approached Novaya Zemlya, was hit and sunk. Finally, after staying in a harbor in that archipelago for a while, where they felt safe from air raids, they did put together a rescue plan. A number of British and German and Russian ships came up out of Archangel to cover for them and carried them safely down to Archangel. When they arrived in Archangel, because they'd already been named as lost by the Germans, and they were now all white and wearing sheets, they were quickly called the ghost ships of Archangel, which is where the title of that book comes from. And this is just a picture of the Silver Sword there in the center, taken from the Troubadour on the way of that last leg of the trip. So this is the course of Convoy 17, and you can see the images of all of the ships that were sunk. And these are the German bases along Norway, so you can see how well fortified Germany had made that coast. So of the original 35 merchant ships that left Iceland, 2 turned back on the first day because of the ice damage that they had. 11 ultimately reached Archangel, and 22 were sunk in the Barents Sea. So how'd they get home from there? On the 13th of September, the Silver Sword left Archangel in a convoy QP 14 heading back to the States, carrying chrome ore and pulpwood and animal hides, which is what the Russians had to trade for the military supplies that they were receiving. And a week later, 3 torpedoes hit the Silver Sword, mortally wounding 1 person and setting the ship on fire. Captain Colbeth got his entire crew safely off the ship and into lifeboats, and then to rescue ships that were nearby. And the hulk of the Silver Sword was sunk by an Allied destroyer. So on the 14th of October, Colbeth returned to Boston on the Queen Mary, but he brought his whole crew home with him, having lost only 1 crew member on the entire voyage, despite 2 U-boat confrontations. Quite quickly, Winston Churchill realized what an accomplishment this was. And this is a letter that Colbeth received from the head of that administration that oversaw all of the American Liberty boats and warshipping. And the highlighted paragraph says, Mr. Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister, has particularly requested that he be associated with this message of congratulations. After an adventure like that, it was a little tough to get people to make the Murmansk run. But mariners kept doing it, partly encouraged by glorious posters like this that just show how safe it's going to be getting into Murmansk with the Russian Navy flying over you and all of these destroyers protecting you. And that's the way the process continued. The tide changed in 1942, the tide of the whole Battle of the Atlantic. This is for a number of reasons. The convoys figured out new routing techniques. They had broken the German code and so could understand more about where the U-boats were going to be. They had better air cover for the convoys because they developed a technique of bringing aircraft carriers or homemade aircraft carriers out with the convoys so that there could be air cover in that gap in the Atlantic. And then there'd been a number of technological improvements. And one of the things that I learned in my research about all this was how many of the technological improvements came from Great Britain, who not only had invented sonar in the first place, but then because of the necessity of the war, came up with a number of other special techniques. One was called HFDUF, which is high frequency directional finding, which is a radio technique of if there was a radio signal being sent, you could locate what direction it was coming from and how far away the sender was. And since since the U-boat wolf packs spoke entirely by radio signal back and forth when they were surfaced and thought that they were secure because they were all with the German code, this gave an absolute way to locate where the U-boats were, either for the defenses to go after them or for the convoy to avoid them. There was an advance in radar, which allowed airborne radar to actually see something as small as the periscope or the snorkel of a U-boat as it was running along the surface. And so it was much easier for the air forces to now find the U-boats as they were coming in their attacks. And the British added to their aircraft something called ley lights, which were gigantic floodlights that when they were approaching a radar target, they'd wait until they were less than a mile away and then turn on the floodlights. And it gave the U-boat captain less than 25 seconds to respond to the fact that he was about to be bombed by an airplane flying over it. And then there was the development of the Hedgehog forward-throwing mortar, which is what got me started on all this in the first place. That's a Hedgehog. What it was a device to throw a large number of contact explosive devices well ahead of the ship that was firing. That said, you could fire out when your sonar could still find the submarine. You could shoot ahead to where you thought it was going to be. So you didn't lose the contact that you did with sonar when the submarine was underneath you. It made a broader circle of a field of contact, as it were. And these only exploded if they actually hit something. So that if they didn't hit something, you didn't get the disturbance in the water that the depth charges had caused. And so the sonar contact could be maintained as the battle with the U-boat continued. So this is just a picture of what hedgehogs look like when they hit the water, fired well ahead of the ship, the target's still in the sonar range, and hopefully you'd find something. And they proved to be very, very effective. And so in 1943, at the beginning of the year, the Germans changed some of their U-boat Enigma coding, and that blinded the British at Bletchley Park, who were their British code breakers, for a whole 9 days. It's amazing to me that they were able to take that apart so quickly. But in that 9 days, 82 ships were sunk by U-boats in the Atlantic, and there started being some talk in Britain that they were just going to be unable to continue the war. But suddenly those new technologies that I'd mentioned all came together with improved experience, improved tactics, and 15 U-boats were destroyed in April of 1943. A convoy ONS-5, which had 43 ships in it, was attacked by 30 U-boats, and 13 of the 43 merchant ships were sunk, but also 6 U-boats were lost, which was a bigger individual battle than they'd ever experienced before. And then a total of 43 U-boats were destroyed in May because of these new techniques and technology, which was 25% of the entire operational strength of the U-boat force at that point. And so Admiral Donitz called off operations in the North Atlantic for the U-boats. They came back a few months later, trying to meet the technological problems that had been raised, but they had far fewer victories. In September, 8 merchant ships and 6 warships were sunk, but 39 U-boats were lost. And so operations were called off again. And they were only sporadic from then to the end of the war. Wolfpack techniques basically were left aside for just individual hit and miss types of targeting. The final actions of the War of the Atlantic were on the 7th and 8th of May, 1945. A U-boat was sunk on the 7th, and on the 8th, a Norwegian minesweeper and 2 freighters were sunk just before the Germans surrendered. And then 127, which were all that remained of the German U-boat force, were surrendered to the Allies. So what were the costs of the Battle of the Atlantic? The Allies lost 36,000 sailors in all those warships, 36,000 merchant seamen in the ships that went down, 3,500 merchant vessels, and 175 warships. But only 10% of all the convoys were attacked. And the average kill rate when a convoy was attacked was only about 1 in 10 of the merchant ships would be sunk, which meant that 99% of all the ships in the merchant ships in the Battle of the Atlantic made it successfully to their intended ports. The Germans, on the other hand, lost 30,000 sailors as well, 783 submarines, 85% of their entire submarine force, 47 other warships, and they totally failed to blockade Britain or to prevent the buildup for D-Day. So this is a great accomplishment by the merchant mariners who were sailing all those ships. And how have they been recognized? The Soviets recognized them right away. Right after the war, they were offering not only medals, but free tram service in the cities of Russia and things to the merchant mariners who had served in this capacity. But the United States quickly said, well, no, don't go accepting honors like that from the Soviet Union. You can take the medals as souvenirs, but you are not a commander of the great country or whatever title they were bestowing. And they again gave 50-year medals and the anniversary of the convoy, PQ-17 convoy in 1992. Great Britain, as you saw in the letter I showed you, acknowledged the Civil Sword and the mariners' role in the Battle of Atlantic as a whole, because he knew that nothing else he did in the war, whether it was done by the Air Force or by the Army or by his Navy, nothing else that was done could have been accomplished if that lifeline from North America had been disrupted. US recognition, however, lagged. I think one of the reasons for this is that during the 1950s, there was the big Red Scare, McCarthy and all, and there were allegations that the leaders of the Mariners Union, who obviously all of these mariners had been associated with, that they were communists. And so nothing could be done for the mariners because they were not loyal. Lawsuits followed, and eventually veteran status was awarded to the mariners in the 1980s. But that was too late for many of them to use any of the benefits that were extended to veterans. It was too late for them to go to college on the GI Bill or any of that. So Ellsworth Miller said, all I'll ever get for it is a flag for my coffin. Russia, as I said, did acknowledge the Murmansk run again in 1992. And this is a photograph of Ellsworth Miller, who did go to accept the award. Donna says it's partly because he wanted to accept the award, but mostly because he wanted to see the Liberty ship that it was being presented on to remind him of his days at sea. And then finally, this year, May 20th, Congress voted one medal to honor all of the World War II mariners. And this is it being accepted on their behalf in Washington on May 20th. But we on Chebeague don't recognize people en masse. We recognize them for their individual accomplishments. Thank you. So I probably told you everything I know about this, but I'll try questions if there are any. Otherwise, I hope you've enjoyed hearing a too unknown saga of Chebeague. Oh, so no questions from there. Anything from the audience? Dan?
When Ellsworth Miller received his award from Toby, he traveled to Russia to do that?
No, it's not in Boston, Donna? Where? Baltimore.
We spent the week with her, and Barbara got to go as well. It was very moving. And one thing that, it was very difficult for the merchant mariners not to be recognized by its own country. You can imagine, he's been through what Toby's described. And in 2004, my daughter was going to school in London, and I took my son Tom and Tyler Putnam over there for a vacation. And the boys had decided they wanted to go to the Imperial War Museum. Well, I never even heard of them. Wasn't even on my list. So we went, and if you've never been there, it's incredible. But they had the whole second floor was dedicated to the American Merchant Marine and how they would not have survived the war if it had not been for the American Merchant Marine, keep bringing them supplies and keeping them in the war. I mean, it brought tears to our eyes. I mean, it was very moving to see that England and Russia appreciated what the people here did more than this country.
We've identified the people we know of from Chebeague who participated. And actually for Ashley Johnson and Bud Robinson, I don't know much about where their service was. I just know that they were in the Merchant Marine. But if there are others that people are aware of, please let me know so we can include them in the record as well.
And so the one thing you will find all of those names on because the people of Chebeague recognize them as veterans. And they had flags, even though in the cemetery, even though they were not recognized until 1988.
Tinica?
My husband's father was in the Merchant Marine hit by a torpedo, and they were in a lifeboat 10 days before they found
Wow. And which, was it in the North Atlantic or in one of the other ports? In the Atlantic. Yeah. Oh, terrifying experience. Well, thank you all. Thank you. There's a new exhibit at the Historical Society on growing up on Chebeague. It's a much happier subject than this one, so please go.
And this is just a quick reminder. On September 12th, Nick Russell's going to be lecturing on Putin. When he first decided that that would be the topic was before the Ukraine. And it was Putin, friend or foe. And now it's Putin with a question mark. But we hope to see you then. Thank you to the people on Zoom. Thank you all for coming out, and thank you, Toby Webb. Thank you, Cap.